Hi, everyone. Good to see you all here. My name's Carl Robichaud. I work at Longview Philanthropy. I co-lead our nuclear grant-making program there. And we have some really great content this weekend on nuclear weapons policy issues. Earlier today, Scott Sagan gave a terrific keynote talk, and that will be available to watch online for those of you who missed it in person. We have this session, and immediately after this session, we have office hours, which is a great opportunity to come and talk about whatever you're working on and how it relates to the issues that we've discussed today. And both Rose and Scott are terrific mentors and are known for their mentorship and have great connections inside and outside of government and academia. So really wonderful people to talk to, especially if you're early in your career and you're thinking about what you might want to do on this issue. It's a really discouraging moment to be talking about nuclear risk reduction and nuclear arms control. And for me, coming to a community like this, where there are a lot of young and energetic people who are committing their lives to reducing risks, that gives me a lot of energy and a lot of hope for the future. So I want to thank you all for being here and for the work that you're doing. Today, we have Rose Gottemoeller with us. And I'm going to read your bio because it's extensive. Rose is a lecturer at Stanford University and the Institute for International Studies there. And previously, she was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And she helped drive forward NATO's adaptation to new circumstances there. Before NATO, she served for almost 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US Department of State, where she was advising the Secretary of State on arms control, nonproliferation, and political military affairs issues. So a very senior role in the Obama administration. And as secretary, before that, she was Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance from 2009 to 2010. And she was the chief negotiator of the New START Treaty. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Prior to her government service, she was senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she directed the Carnegie Moscow Center. So she lived and worked in Moscow for several years. And her book, Negotiating the New START Treaty, was published a couple years ago, and it was the winner of the Douglas Dillon Book Award for a book of distinction on the practice of American diplomacy. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Carl. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah. So big news this week is that Russia...
I've had a headache. I've had a headache all week. It's like my baby was strangled in its crib, you know. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead with the question.
So Russia announced it was suspending compliance with the New START Treaty. That's the treaty that limits deployed warheads in the US and in Russia. And you've written a piece in the Financial Times about the implications of this. But just for us here, what does this mean? What are the implications? What happens next?
Well, first I want to start out with a small note of optimism, which frankly at the moment I don't really share, but I think we need to take note of the fact that the Russians have suspended and not ripped up the treaty. They have said that and Putin is the one who has been leading the charge on this, he has said that the Russian Federation will stay inside the limits of the New START Treaty. The treaty limits the United States and Russian Federation to 700 delivery vehicles each. Those are the missiles and the bomber platforms, the weapons that go on the bombers, and then 1,550 deployed warheads. So it's a treaty that does limit nuclear arms, and Putin has said they'll stay inside those limits. They're not ripping up the treaty and starting to build up right away. So I think we have to take note of that and think about everything we can do to get the Russians to essentially come back to full implementation of the treaty, because on-site inspections were stopped during the COVID pandemic. Now they've stopped the notifications that the two sides exchange day in and day out. This has been so important during this Ukraine crisis because the Russian strategic rocket forces, their nuclear navy, their nuclear air force, they have kept sending us practically every day notifications of the operational status of their nuclear systems. So for example, they take one of their intercontinental ballistic missiles out of a silo and send it to a maintenance facility, they would have to send us a notification. So as you can imagine, during this crisis in Ukraine, that has been a huge and continuing mutual confidence builder. Yes, we know from our big satellites flying overhead, what the status is. We can tell a lot of things from that, but also to get their notifications to tell us what they're doing and then to be able to confirm that against the satellite pictures we're getting, that is a real confidence builder. So it has been really useful during this Ukraine crisis, and that's what's halted now.
Yeah. What's going on here? So you're someone who negotiated the treaty, sat across from your counterparts in Russia, and really hammered out the challenging details here. You then went on to NATO, and you worked side by side with NATO allies in Europe to understand what Russia's doing and how to respond. What is the stated reason that Russia no longer wants to be part of this treaty? And what do you think is really going on?
The Russians say, and there is some way you can do this under international law, they say that there has been a fundamental change in the foundations upon which the treaty is built. The United States and Russia for the past 50 years have said that we have a mutual interest in having predictability with regard to our strategic nuclear forces and building slowly down those weapon systems, reducing them, controlling them, limiting them. This process started with the Cuban Missile Crisis when we came right up to the edge of nuclear annihilation, a nuclear holocaust. And after that, the Soviet Union and the United States slowly started building toward a system of strategic arms limitation, control, and reduction. And so this is now really a 60-year legacy, I would say, and it is being interrupted by this action. Many of us fear that this is the end of strategic nuclear arms control as we've known it. Again, I want to leave that tiny note of optimism out there. They're not tearing up the treaty, but it's going to take some heavy lifting to get back, I think, on a good path.
And even if Russia were to come back into the treaty is set to expire in February 2026.
It is, but the United States and Russia, before this terrible war broke out in Ukraine, we were both resolved to replace the treaty with a new treaty to carry on the process of further reductions and elimination of weapons. Just by way of telling you how far we've come over all these years, in the 1960s, the United States built 32,000 warheads, and the Russians, by some accounting, had over 40,000 warheads. So we have come a long way now. Now we have, under the treaty, 1,550 deployed warheads, and that is of a total number of approximately 4,000 on both the US and Russian side. So 4,000 US, 4,000 Russian, 1,550 of those are deployed. So that's a long way we have come since the height of the 1960s and the height of the Cold War. But again, I'm a little concerned now that we will see an interruption. The Chinese are starting to build up now. All of a sudden, could we be on the cusp of another buildup in nuclear weapons for your working lives? And I think that is something to be really concerned about.
So let's talk about that, because there are folks in the US who think the US needs more nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And they look at the world, they say this is a dangerous world. Russia doesn't want to be bound by these treaties. They're developing and deploying weapons that violate the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They've got all these esoteric systems that are out there now. In addition, you've got China, which always had a very small and recessed nuclear arsenal. Mm-hmm. They were fairly responsible in how they talked about nuclear weapons. We now have estimates that China's arsenal has gone from 200 to about 350 today. And a lot of people think it will be over 1,000 in a decade. And the New START Treaty doesn't limit China at all. It doesn't limit Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons, mm-hmm. right? So why is this treaty in US interests, given everything else that's going on?
Well, let's start with New START itself. Again, these treaties have been bilateral up to this point because US and USSR, now Russia, we were the ones who were building up to a certain level of parity or equality between the two sides. But we built up to a high level And then, as I said, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the urge was to begin to reduce and eliminate these weapons. And again, a very good thing. The Russians have been cheating on certain arms control treaties. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, so-called INF, that limited missiles between 500 and 5,500 kilometers in range. It was a ban on such weapons, and it was in existence from the late 1980s until 2019, when the United States pulled out of the treaty because the Russians were cheating. They were building a new missile called the 9M729 that violated the treaty's commitments. And so INF has gone away now, and that's what
Could I pause for a second?
Sure.
What's the significance of INF? Why are we concerned about that range of missiles?
That range of missiles, usually, it seems like a difference of just a few minutes, but it's significant when you talk about strategic stability. Intercontinental missiles take approximately 25 minutes to half an hour to fly the intercontinental range. And so there's considered, it's not much warning, but a fair amount of warning for decision making. In the case of intermediate range systems that are between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, deployed in Europe, or if they're deployed in Russia within range of NATO Europe, they can strike very quickly, 15 minutes or less, to get from a place in Europe to Moscow. And the worry there is what is called decapitation, that they would be used for a surprise attack on command and control and on the leadership in Moscow, and so forth. In that way, the government would be decapitated. And that
Only in nuclear issues is
Yeah,
decapitation a euphemism for something much worse, right?
Exactly. It's pretty bad, though, but the same idea then for NATO, right? That NATO capitals, all within range of this new missile that the Russians were building, could easily be decapitated without enough warning to respond. I know this seems pretty esoteric, but it's on these kinds of numbers that the nuclear stability calculations are built. And so that was the significance of a ban on such systems for 25, 30 years, that they were really out of the scope of the threat environment we were trying to deal with. And so for that reason, it was seen to be a good thing. And it was a bad thing when suddenly Russia started threatening NATO capitals again with such weapons.
Yeah. And what about the non-strategic nuclear weapons? Russia has a massive numerical advantage over the US, if you want to call it an advantage, in those non-strategic weapons. And how do they get folded into future arrangements, if we can get back to the table?
Yeah, non-strategic nuclear weapons, Scott mentioned this morning, TAC nukes tends to be the kind of blanket phrase for them, but it's not very accurate. These are weapons that are on shorter range missiles, shorter range delivery systems, and they could be used in a regional war, in a regional struggle. That's what we're worried about could get used, for example, in Ukraine. So the Russians have maintained a larger arsenal. In some ways, a warhead is a warhead. If you put it on a longer range system, it becomes a strategic warhead. If you put it on a shorter range system, it becomes non-strategic or tactical. But the Russians do have a lot of warheads that they devote to these non-strategic missions. And so for a long time, the United States has said we have got to get control on these larger numbers of Russian warheads in this class. But let me stress, you were asking about the kind of failings, as people call them, of the New START Treaty. New START was negotiated in 2009 when we were focused on really continuing the kinds of limitations we had in the past, and we always knew that the next task we would turn to was putting constraints on non-strategic nuclear warheads. And I think that that is the US top objective in the next negotiation, to get a limit really on all warheads, non-strategic, strategic, whether they're deployed or non-deployed, to have a single limit on all warheads, and in that way begin to control warheads directly. Let me just say one, again, kind of esoteric, but the thing about the past treaties that we've had is they've always controlled warheads because they've been associated with their missile. We haven't tried to dive in and actually verify and monitor warheads on the tops of missiles because they've been so sensitive, and they're the top secrets of the United States and Russia, how warheads are designed, how warheads are emplaced on missiles. And so we always just said, okay, here's the missile, and we know from the test flight that it carries 4 warheads or 8 or 10, and we'll just count it as having that many warheads on it. But we never went directly to look until the New START Treaty. That's actually one of the things I'm most proud about with the New START Treaty. We began to take steps to actually monitor the objects on the front end of missiles and determine whether they're nuclear or non-nuclear.
So that's a really big distinction, going from just counting delivery vehicles to counting warheads.
Right.
It's a step change in how politically and technically difficult it is. And this is something you've talked about, is the need for innovation in terms of monitoring technology and monitoring procedures. Because if you're getting down there and if you're going into the other sides and looking at their warheads and trying to determine if something's really a warhead, that's a difficult technical challenge, and it requires a lot of trust. And we were in a different time when this treaty was negotiated.
Absolutely, and we always knew it was going to be a big challenge to get to the problem of monitoring warheads directly. And neither we nor the Russians are going to want foreign inspectors to have access to the technical details of how the warhead is designed. So they will always be in containers. They will always be hidden from direct view. And this is a major technical task that the experts in this community have been wrestling with because, again, top objective for the United States in the next negotiation is to begin to get directly to monitoring warheads, and that's going to require a lot of information barriers. It's going to require a lot of, I think, capability also to be able to, I don't know to the extent to which we can do it, but to at least monitor perimeters around warhead storage facilities so we know what is coming and what is going, maybe without having the opportunity to get directly inside a warhead storage facility.
So if there's anyone out there who's interested in knowledge barriers and cryptography, these are the types of fields that we'll need to integrate as we move forward.
Absolutely, and we've been at Stanford doing some interesting work on cryptographic techniques applied to the way we count and trace warheads in transit, and that's been some really important work. And so we are welcoming definitely new ideas in this area.
When you go back and you look at the signing of New START, and you see that table, and you see Obama sitting at the table, the person signing that treaty is Medvedev.
Yep.
And so there was a sense that the US-Russia relationship might be taking a different direction, and that this was the start of a process that would result in more treaties and in more cooperation going forward. And as we've seen with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine, and now the war in Ukraine, we've gone in a very different direction. I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine here.
And Medvedev's become the bad guy.
Yeah,
he's the one who's issuing again,
threats.
Scott Sagan raised this morning the kind of terrible threats he's been throwing out about direct use of nuclear weapons, nuclear saber rattling over the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, he could have maybe listened to Toby Ord's talk on virtues this morning. I think he could have gotten something out of that.
Might have been a good thing.
So how does Russia see nuclear weapons in its current conflict in Ukraine? We've seen statements by Vladimir Putin where he's kind of rattled the nuclear saber and then he's walked it back.
Yep. He's always the straight man, and then he sends out, or I guess, I'm not going to call him a good cop, but he's always the one who puts the kind of general threat picture out there. We are not bluffing. You know what I mean. And then it is people like Medvedev or Solovyov, this terrible guy. Some of you may have seen this news film where he and his cohort, they showed a clip of London going up in nuclear conflagration, and they were laughing about it on the Sunday evening news. It's just been horrible. But Putin's kept a step back from that, but you know that he is threatening.
Now, why hasn't Russia used nuclear weapons yet in Ukraine? This is one of those puzzles. They have the weapons. They presumably have targets for those weapons, and they've held that back.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there have been moments, and this has come out in the press, there have been moments in this war over the last year where our intelligence organizations were really concerned that they were getting close to using nuclear weapons. But then I think, and I agree with again, reporting that's been out there that Putin himself, there was a really interesting piece in the Financial Times just yesterday that talked about this. Putin himself, talking to his generals, they came to the conclusion that the difficulties of using a nuclear weapon to try to gain some tactical advantage on the battlefields in Ukraine, that it just wasn't worth it. So in terms of military utility, they backed off on that front. Then we had the problem of, well, perhaps we see a nuclear demonstration strike, or shall we see a single use of a weapon somewhere on Ukrainian territory to try to terrify the Ukrainians and terrify Ukraine's partners, and really then drive them to the negotiating table. So I do think that that's a real scenario, and it's a scenario that could still play out. But I believe that Putin has actually been constrained by the nuclear taboo throughout the history of the 77 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The USSR and the Russian Federation have made great propaganda hay out of the fact that the United States was the only country to have used nuclear weapons in wartime. And so I do think that there's been a constraining effect that if Putin makes the decision, and if the Russian Federation uses a weapon in Ukraine, even in a demonstration strike over the Black Sea, that the moral burden of using a nuclear weapon in wartime will shift from the United States to the Russian Federation. And I do think that that's had a breaking effect on the decision-making as well. So there's a military aspect of it, but I also think there's a political and a kind of propaganda aspect to it.
And a diplomatic aspect, because we know, for example, that China and India have signaled that they really don't want Russia to use nuclear weapons in this conflict.
Absolutely. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in November in Kazakhstan was remarkable because Putin was there and he got publicly called on the carpet by both Xi Jinping and by Prime Minister Modi from India saying, do not use nuclear weapons in this war. And this message they are continuing to put out publicly, including when Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was at the Munich Security Conference last weekend. He put out 4 no's about this war, and one of those no's was no use of nuclear weapons. So they are publicly messaging the Kremlin and Putin himself about this, and that's a very important
So I think it's really interesting, and we're talking about a really dangerous time in nuclear affairs and a really dispiriting time, but I see this as a sign of hope, that the nuclear taboo is sufficiently strong in some countries that people don't want to use nuclear weapons, and it's really seen as a weapon of last resort. We've seen Russia talk about this crisis as something that's existential for the Russian nation.
Yes.
We've seen the Russian soldiers and Russian commanders do all kinds of terrible, terrible things on the battlefield.
Yes.
But nuclear weapons might be a bridge too far.
Maybe, but I do think we absolutely must continue to be concerned about the possibility of use in wartime, particularly at the point when Putin finally realizes that he's being defeated. Mm-hmm. And there was a really interesting this week commentary as the New START withdrawal was going on from several very good Russian experts, including a former colleague of mine from Moscow. His name is Alexei Arbatov, and he was answering questions, in one of the newspapers. It was Echo Moskvy, actually. And he said, well, we're seeing here evidence of what Putin learned on the streets of Petersburg. Well, it was actually a reference to some of you may know this famous story, that when Putin was a boy, he cornered a rat on a street in Leningrad, and the rat jumped him, didn't submit and didn't run away, and so Putin ended up having to kill the rat. And so it's like the street fighting element that is part of Putin's persona, and the fact that he could react in that way, if he suddenly decides he's done, he's cornered, he's lost the war, that he would react by some great violence. And I think that is a real concern that I continue to have, and I think many of us in the field continue to have, that's the scenario.
Well.
Yes.
And Scott Sagan talked about it earlier,
about that this morning.
Gambling for redemption, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who put weight in the Metaculus forecasts, there's something about 2.3% chance of Russian use of nuclear weapons this year, about 1 in 40. And my thinking is this war is likely to go on for more than 1 year, unfortunately. Nobody knows what the future will hold, but it could be that a year from now we're looking at some of the same lines of division between lines of division in Ukraine.
I am holding out hope that the spring offensive by the Ukrainians can lead to some success. Particularly, I took very seriously what the UK Minister of Defense had to say last weekend when he said the Russians have ground up so much of their heavy equipment, their weapon systems, their armor, and their people. They are killing so many people, 200,000 people injured and killed. And those are men, because there aren't women in the Russian armed forces except in very particular roles, non-combat roles. So, you know, there are limits to how much force they can put in the field this spring.
Let's talk about China for a second.
Okay.
So the U.S. intelligence community apparently said that China is considering starting to sell lethal arms to Russia in this war. If they would do that, there would be sanctions that would be kicking in.
Definitely.
And so the U.S. would be sanctioning the world's second largest economy over its strategic partnership with Russia. Can you talk a little bit about that strategic partnership? How deep does it go? Do you think China would be willing to cross that line? And if it did, would the U.S. impose sanctions? What would that mean for the world order?
The U.S. would definitely impose sanctions, and that's part of the messaging that's gone between Washington and Beijing in this past week. So I know that everybody in Washington is watching very closely. President Biden spoke about this yesterday and said basically don't do it, because the Russians and the Chinese would then be heavily under the pressure of sanctions. And it was interesting what the president said yesterday in talking about this publicly. He said when he spoke to Xi last at the G20 meeting back in the fall, he said, I wasn't threatening him, but I said, just look at what happened in Russia when 600 US and European corporations picked up and left immediately. He said, I'm not threatening you, but just bear in mind what happened in that case. So I think that there would be a strong effort by the United States to make sure that the economic impact on China would be severe. And up to this point, China has actually been very constrained because they haven't wanted to come under secondary sanctions from helping even under the table. They have been somewhat helping. And that's the meaning of these additional sanctions that were laid on yesterday, to get out of that sanctions busting activity that has flowed not only from China, but even from places like Turkey, putative ally of the United States. I'm happy to talk about Turkey too, but it's not so relevant to this conversation. Anyway, the bottom line is that I'm wondering, you know, if China will be warned off, and it's my hunch that it will be warned off, because I believe that there are limits to the China-Russia partnership without end, or friendship without end, what it's called. And you saw it in the example I raised a moment ago, that she has publicly reproved, and his foreign minister has continually publicly reproved the Russians over nuclear use in Ukraine. So I think there are limits on the partnership. We've seen some great street theater this week with Wang Yi going to Moscow, and, you know, a lot of, so they've got their political burden to bear in terms of portraying their continued friendship with the Russians. But to be honest with you, the other factor here is they see the Russians as going down as an economy and going down as a national entity. They don't want to be dragged with it.
It's not an equal partnership.
It's not in their interest to be dragged down into the dirt with Russia.
I mean, one of my fears is that China crosses that line, U.S. imposes the sanctions. Once sanctions are imposed, it's very easy to impose sanctions. It's very hard to lift them.
It's true.
And that's one thing we've seen in a lot of cases, is sanctions tend to stick around. And people talk about a new Cold War between US and China. I think that metaphor is overused, but this is a case where that could start to come to pass.
Yes.
I want to remind everyone you can ask questions. So I'm nearing the end of my prepared questions. If you go to this session on SwapCard, you'll find an opportunity to submit questions. They'll appear up here, hopefully. Last time they didn't, but hopefully they'll appear and I will ask them. So New START expires 2026, if it's not dead already. how can we limit the use of nuclear use, the risk of nuclear use, or limit the risk of a runaway new arms race in a world without binding treaties? Because it doesn't seem like binding treaties are going to be an option anymore.
Well, I'm not going to give up hope.
Yeah,
Let me
don't
just
give
be
up
on
hope.
the clear record saying I'm not going to give up hope on negotiated restraint, because I think in the end of the day, it is in the interest of the countries who enter into it. The reason why, and let me just really focus in on this for a moment, the reason why Russia and the United States have stayed tethered to these treaties for 50+ years at this point is because they really give us mutual predictability against which we can plan. So the United States has known that the Russians are going to deploy 700 missiles and other delivery vehicles, and no more. And so when we plan for the future of our nuclear force structure, we know what number we are planning against, and furthermore, we know what we have to target against. We target their weapons, they target ours. If we don't have any limits on either side, there's no planning, there's no predictability, and there's the potential for real instability with, arms racing going on. One country surging ahead with a new system, then the other, and never mind the resources that get wasted in that kind of race. So that's why it's been so important to have this kind of predictability over the past 50 years. And that's why I argue to the Chinese. The numbers are much, much lower. I mentioned 4,000 warheads on the US side, 4,000 on the Russians. The Chinese, even the estimates we see out of DOD say 2035, they might have 1,500 warheads. So they are building up, they are modernizing, we must be worried about that, but it is not as if they are in the same status as the United States and the Russian Federation in terms of numbers. But nevertheless, it's high time that the Chinese begin to afford us more predictability about why they're modernizing, what their objectives are for their nuclear forces. And that's why they need to join in the conversation as well. And I think that that is really important. But if we don't have negotiated restraint, if we are stuck without it, we are going to have to fall back on other kinds of capability and capacity. For one thing, in order to gain that predictability, we're going to have to make a huge amount of use of our national technical means. These are the overhead satellites, radars, aircraft, reconnaissance systems that the United States government operates. But furthermore, I think we're going to have to put more and more emphasis on the use of commercial ubiquitous sensing capabilities to help us understand exactly what is going on in Russia and in China, and to help us, again, to have some measure of predictability against which we can plan. When I first started talking about this over a decade ago now, we did not have the same 24/7 coverage of the Earth that we have today. We didn't have the multiple phenomenology available that we're beginning to get today, even on the commercial satellites, where we are getting more ability to penetrate clouds, where we're getting more ability to see at night. So I think, frankly, here's another area where the commercial community and the expert community outside of government can be making a really big contribution to really bolster what the government can do with its so-called national technical means. We're going to need it, because if we don't have treaties, we're not going to have on-site inspection.
Right.
That mechanism, on-site inspection, is tied to the legally binding nature of these treaties. It's a kind of, for both the United States and Russia, you can imagine having Russians wandering around the US ICBM bases out in the West. We had a big brouhaha a couple weeks ago with a Chinese balloon flying at 60,000 feet, but to actually have Russians on the ground looking at this stuff, you need a legal basis for that.
Yeah.
And that's why treaties are so important, among other things. They give that predictability, but they also give a legal foundation for things like on-site inspection. So if we can't do on-site inspection anymore, we're going to need a lot of help in terms of our ability to monitor these systems.
So just since New START has been negotiated, there's been some real technical innovations that provide some new tools.
Exactly.
And so that technology is advancing quickly, even as the need for it is increasing.
Is growing.
And
frankly, one more point on this, Carl, even if we do, it'd be wonderful as far as I'm concerned if in a month or 2 or 3 we got back to on-site inspections with Russia and off we went. By the way, I should mention that the Russians have not, up to this point, cheated on New START. They have not violated the treaty. It was in this recent era when they have refused to resume on-site inspections after the suspension over COVID, and then with Putin suddenly pulling the plug on and suspending the treaty. This is the period where they've entered into non-compliance, but they have been really good about implementing the treaty up to this point. Again, I think because they see it in their interest to do so.
And one of the possibilities is that the US and Russia could continue to abide by the New START limits even in the absence of a formal treaty.
They could.
And the problem is that you just wouldn't know as much about what the other side is actually doing.
Exactly.
If both sides chose to build up, the Federation of American Scientists has suggested that the upload capacity that exists would allow both sides to roughly double their arsenal in just the course of a few years at relatively low cost. And for this community, that's really important because if the worst, it's important for everyone, right? But if the worst happens, that's twice as many warheads that would be in the air.
Yeah, let me just mention what upload looks like. You have an ICBM. Let's just take the example of the big Russian ICBM, the Sarmat, the new heavy missile that's come out. We see them flight testing it. Okay, it's got 10 warheads on top of it. We count it as such because that's what they flight tested. But it's got enough heavy lift capability that it could actually lift, some people say, 15 warheads. So suddenly you take, okay, a missile that had 10 and you up it by 5 and away you go. You've got a lot more targets that they can cover in that way.
So we have a couple questions here about what we can do about this, right? And this is really a community that's focused on actions as well as ideas. And one question is, what role can philanthropy and civil society play in reducing these risks, given that these are the domain of governments, right? A question from Shaquille is, why do you think it is that this issue gets so little attention from philanthropy compared to other issues of similar scope and scale?
Yes, let me answer. I've already talked about where I think there can be a great technical contribution from this community. And it's not only related, of course, to the information that comes off sensor systems, but then you need really good analytic capability, big data analysis to make sense of the information, the data that's coming at you off of these ubiquitous sensing systems. So it's a combination of the sensors themselves, but then the data analysis that goes with it. And so I see a big role for this community in helping us to think through some of these more ambitious tasks that I've been talking about, and even what sensing systems can tell us about smaller units of account like warheads. I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. And by the way, there's been already a very good initiative that governments have sponsored, but it's involved a lot of non-governmental institutions like the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Washington, D.C., looking at the concept of warhead verification. It's called the IPNDV, the Initiative for, never mind, IPNDV, Nuclear Threat Initiative, but it is an initiative that's looking at how to tackle this problem of warhead verification. So already there are people thinking about this, but it has been a very specialized and narrow community, and frankly, I think it gets a little ingrown. So it would, I think, be a breath of fresh air to have more interaction on a broader front with this community that thinks more broadly about applications of AI, that thinks more broadly about applications of information technology overall.
Yeah, and more broadly in terms of think tanks, civil society, advocacy, how did you see that play out with regard to the negotiation and the ratification of New START? And what is the role of that going forward, especially with fewer resources?
Yeah, it was a really good question asked about why this doesn't get more attention, why people aren't more interested. In my career, I had a couple of examples of where that attention just really swung upward, and I'll just give you the example of the ratification process for the New START Treaty. We came out of the negotiations in April of 2009 and then had to take the treaty up to Capitol Hill to get it ratified, and we knew we were dead if we did not get enough Republican senators interested enough in the treaty that they wouldn't just reflexively vote no, because that does tend, on that side of the aisle, that does tend to be the trend, that they are very critical of negotiated arms control overall. So we knew we had to prove the value of the treaty, that the treaty worked, and we knew we had to get their constituents interested, so we would get people coming, sending their letters in, their postcards, calling, so that we would get the people coming to do that kind of advocacy on Capitol Hill with their representatives. And we did a huge amount. It was really, I don't want to say that it was very technology driven at the time. For example, we did not make a huge amount of use of social media. I think we could have done more. Looking back on it now, even in 2009 and 2010, we could have done more in that area. But we did make a huge amount of use of the typical media, TV, radio, newspapers. I went out and talked to for example, the editorial board of the Des Moines, Iowa Register, because I knew that they placed, if the editorial board would agree to support New Start and endorse it, they were also placing articles across that region in the Rockies and in the Midwest. Their articles and their endorsement would go out to a lot of different newspapers and a lot of different settings. And luckily, they were a tough editorial board. They raked me over the coals about the treaty and why it was being criticized, not as good as the previous treaty. There are all kinds of things we could get into, but the bottom line was, in the end, they were willing to endorse the treaty, and that had a huge effect. And the other thing I did was join with not only me, but the entire team. We worked with the Catholic bishops, and we worked with the evangelicals. We worked with the Methodists. We worked with the religious organizations, because if they could get the word out from the pulpits on Sunday, the word again would start coming back to Washington, to the representatives, and it worked. But it was a huge amount of heavy lifting. It was almost like a political campaign to be.
And a lot of these efforts were supported by communications and work that was funded by foundations that were.
Absolutely. So much of the work that was done by the religious groups and also by the advocacy groups working in this area in Washington, they were all funded by the foundation world. And really, it was a fantastic group effort.
And you mentioned in your book as well that the timeline with which you could negotiate New Start was shortened because you had been at the Carnegie Moscow Center and you had been wrangling with these issues for a while, and you knew the parameters through which a deal could be achieved. And in Washington, time is everything, because you can only get so many things done in an administration. And so check that out if you're looking for an interesting case study in how the sausage gets made. It's called Negotiating the New START Treaty.
Yeah, and let me just
Available
say it.
at finer bookstores everywhere.
Yeah, or on Amazon. Or from Cambria Press. They like you to order directly. Just one small point here about that period. I was director of the Carnegie Moscow Center in 2008, and I was going back to Washington in 2009, but I used that year to invite all kinds of people from both sides of the aisle, because I didn't know who was going to be elected in 2008, whether it was going to be a Republican or a Democrat. So I invited people from both sides of the aisle and let the Russians see what the range of viewpoints was in Washington about what the next treaty should look like. And we did a lot of work around that conference table in the Carnegie Moscow Center, just scoping out various ideas for what the next treaty could look like from both a Republican perspective and a Democratic perspective. I think it was really eye-opening for the Russians, both to realize that there were some similarities between the two parties and how they approached these issues, but also some significant differences. But the bottom line is we did a lot of work to clear away the underbrush so that by the time we got into an actual negotiation, we could move rather quickly.
Yeah, that's great. We have a lot of really good questions that have been submitted by people, and I just want to remind people we have office hours immediately after this, so we're not going to get to all of the questions, but you should feel free to come. Rose will be there, Scott will be there, and we also have two excellent CSAC fellows who will be here as well, so we're going to have a conversation about a lot of these issues immediately after the panel. We've got about 10 minutes left, though, so I want to get into some of these questions. A couple here, we have Abigail Thomas asks, Why is direct monitoring of warheads the top US priority in the next set of negotiations, as opposed to limiting tactical weapons? And Damon Binder asks a similar question, or related question. Why are the US and Russia both unhappy for each other to inspect their warheads? Presumably, both sides think the other can competently build warheads, so I wouldn't have thought they would be concerned with copying each other's design. So maybe you could talk about both of those questions together.
Let me start with that one. That's a great question. You're probably right. We both know how to build warheads, right? So what's the big deal if we know what their design is versus they know what our design is? And I think, to be honest, we probably, each of us has a pretty good idea how the other side builds warheads. But this is, it's almost sometimes like secret information, classified information becomes almost a kind of religious thing. And of course you don't want to let the Russians know exactly how you design your warhead. There is a concern that they could put in place countermeasures, special countermeasures that would defeat the warhead somehow, particularly in relation to a missile defense program. If they had a particular knowledge base, perhaps they would have an easier time defeating US warheads if they would, heaven forbid, be launched on Russian territory. But I think mostly it has to do with this kind of sacred nature of classified information, the most sensitive information in the world. And so therefore, both sides just assume that we cannot let the other one know about it. Interestingly enough, though, we have let the Russians know about the fissile material makeup of what goes into our warheads, but the Russians treat their plutonium makeup as a state secret, and they don't let us know. So there are some differentials between the two sides. But I think it has a kind of sacred nature to it.
And Abigail's question about the direct monitoring of warheads as opposed to limiting tactical weapons?
Yeah, the direct monitoring, I am talking about so-called tactical nuclear warheads. So talking about getting direct monitoring of non-strategic nuclear warheads is the top goal, along with getting constraints on these so-called exotic launch systems, the new missile systems that the Russians have been developing.
Are those covered? Would they be counted under New START if New START were extended?
Well, New START has been extended,
and
what
I mean is
two of them have been brought under New START. One is the so-called avant-garde boost glide system, and the other is the Sarmat, the heavy missile I referred to.
So those two are counted.
Are already covered under New START.
Strategic range, good. So we have a couple. We're going to go lightning round here.
All right.
How do you see Turkey's role in the crisis, given that they're a member of NATO?
I think Turkey has played an amazing role in this crisis, and that is because they are the ones who have been able to talk both to Russia and to Ukraine, and also as a NATO ally to the United States and to NATO. And they have been, so far, the problem solvers in this crisis. They are really affecting the prisoner exchanges that are going on. It's their intervention that has gotten this steady momentum of prisoner exchanges, and the Black Sea grain deal, under which over 20 million tons of foodstuffs have flowed out of Ukraine. That also was negotiated with the help of not only the Turks, but also the UN. So the Turks have been playing a good role here. They're not easy to deal with, but and I do think they're going to let eventually Sweden and Finland into NATO, but that's another topic.
It's going to take a little time. Jack Lewers asks, would you endorse the US publicly committing to a no first use policy with nuclear weapons?
No, and I'll tell you why. And we can argue about this, but I think it's essentially a declaratory policy that is meaningless because it will not, in the end of the day, help us to have, again, any more predictability about what is going on the Russian side or on the Chinese side. In the end of the day, we have to depend upon our ability to respond. And of course, we emphasize that our chances of using nuclear weapons are extremely remote, and that we focus on defending ourselves with other kinds of capabilities, not with nuclear weapons. But I really worry that depending on and arguing about no first use over and over and over again really takes the air out of what we actually need to do, which is get practical, pragmatic constraints on nuclear weapons.
And how do we do that?
Continuing to negotiate.
China won't talk with us.
This is true, but they won't talk with us right now. But as I said, we need to keep pushing them, because I think that eventually they will be convinced that the predictability that we have gained by entering into these kinds of negotiations with the Russians and the Soviets before them will benefit them as well. But we must bear in mind, for our part, that their arsenal continues to be much, much smaller than the arsenal of the United States and Russia.
And can I mention that you're part of a Track 1.5 dialogue with China? So even as there's no official dialogues between US and China and US and Russia, Rose and another number of other people who are often former officials, top scientists, et cetera, are meeting with each other and discussing, here are the contours of the problem, here's the contours of what an agreement could look like if we can get some political will to do it. So just understanding the other side. I think that's one of the things for me, one of the most underrated traits in international politics is empathy and understanding what motivates the other side. And that's something that I think you really have brought to the table, is a deep understanding of Russia's views on these issues. And unfortunately, we're in a position where Russia's views are deeply shaped by the preferences of one individual. So you're talking with folks in the Russian strategic forces who understand the importance of predictability for New START, but you might have Vladimir Putin, who sees this, more importantly, as a political weapon or as a signaling mechanism rather than understanding some of the underlying, or buying into the underlying dynamics.
Well, Putin has called this treaty the gold standard of treaties. He really liked it up until a month or two ago, when he decided he could use it to try to lever the United States and get us to turn our back on Ukraine. And the United States is simply not going to do this. The United States has been very clear that you cannot connect our interest in nuclear restraint to this other set of goals with regard to helping the Ukrainians to defend themselves. So to my mind, Putin is untethered from the national security interests of Russia at the moment, because he's pouring everything into his Ukraine adventure and subjugating the Ukrainians. But he's forgetting that it makes sense for Russia not to see the United States begin to build up nuclear weapons, untethered from any limits under a treaty of that kind.
We have a couple questions about why do we need so many nuclear weapons? What's possibly
That's a great question.
How could you possibly need more than 1,000 nuclear weapons? So I'm going to ask that question. The other question is about nuclear accidents. Is there anything the US could do unilaterally to reduce the likelihood that nuclear weapons are used inadvertently, or that there's an accident?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. We have done a lot over the years to avoid nuclear accidents and incidents. We need to pay attention to our own nuclear force structure and the necessity of ensuring against accidents and incidents. A decade and a half ago, we had some pretty serious incidents here in the United States. So it's very important we keep our own house in order, but we've also done a lot of work over the years training and exercising with other countries. There's not a lot of nuclear weapons states around, that's a good thing, but with regard to nuclear power plant fuel and radioactive waste and so forth. So we need to keep up that international work to train and exercise in that area. And the other question, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Accidents. How do we prevent accidents?
Well, I think, once again, we focus on training, we focus on procedure, and we focus on making sure that people are alert to the dangers and the threats of nuclear accidents.
Are we putting pressure on Russia and China in ways that makes their accidents more likely? To put it differently, there is an enormous focus in the US on improving command and control, early warning systems, cyber resilience. We're spending a lot of money on that.
Right.
My concern in some ways is what are we doing to prevent accidents in Russia, China, North Korea?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, unfortunately, Carl, and this is a topic we could discuss a lot more. We're down to our last minutes here, but we went through a phase after the breakup of the Soviet Union when we were really concerned about loose nukes, accidents and incidents, even black market sales of Soviet nuclear weapons and fissile material. We went through this period where we worked together in a cooperative way with the Russians. And even with the Chinese, we had some cooperative projects going on. But now I'm afraid we're getting to a period where we have to think through how can we tackle accidents and incidents and preventing them without that kind of cooperation. It's uncooperative threat reduction, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And again, I would welcome the opportunity to work with this community and think through some of the approaches we might take to an uncooperative environment for trying to keep nuclear weapons safe.
Well, thank you for being here with us today. After Toby's talk this morning, we had lunch together, and you mentioned you thought that there was a virtue missing from the ones he put up on the screen. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
My favorite virtue actually is persistence. And I've kept my eye on, I don't think often about Calvin Coolidge, but he did write about persistence. There's a rather famous quote from him, but I do think it is a virtue for this field especially to be persistent.
Yeah, well, we've had some setbacks in the nuclear risk reduction field. We've had some setbacks in this broader community, and the work that matters, let's just keep at it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.